Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. Welcome to our May edition of OT Office Hours. I'm Sam Becker. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Insane Cyber. At Insane Cyber, we're focused on combining host and network data for analysis to give you a full picture of your OT cybersecurity to detect, secure, and maintain resilience among an evolving threat landscape. We are also joined today by Patrick Miller, the CEO of industrial cybersecurity consulting firm Ampyx Cyber, and one of the original architects and first regulator of the NERC CIP standards. So it makes him a great guest for today's OT office hours, where we're going to be talking about staying compliant during incidents. With that, we've also got our CEO and founder of Insane Cyber here, Dan Gunter. Just as a quick housekeeping note, feel free to submit any questions that you have either via the chat or Q&A functions, and we will answer those throughout the webinar. So with that, I will turn it over to Dan and Patrick to get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Patrick, how about you give any other overview with also how'd you get to where you're at in your career? Give us a little history and backstory on who Patrick Miller is and how he got to be the expert in this area.
I'm really just a taco vendor. I've got a little cart down on the corner and a chicken or beef. Yeah. I was started in telecom a long time ago, like climbing poles with a test set and gear. And then went into like wiring up MDFs, IDFs as the analog to digital transformation happened. Got into a bunch of manufacturing SCADA environments at that time, doing a bunch of upgrades. Ripping out a lot of the old like KSUs, putting in DSUs and upgrading a lot of their systems. Fast forward, went through a bunch of different data center upgrades, early then co-location centers and that kind of thing. So fell in love with the power sector and joined it in '97. And then was lucky enough to be the SCADA security lead for the Olympic event in 2002. Our utility was the power provider for the Olympics in Salt Lake City and for every neighboring state. So I had a lot of work to do in a short amount of time. Of course, it was under the threat of the potential terrorist attack. So made a lot of good friends during that, which kind of positioned me well for being one of the original architects of the NERC CIP standards. We obviously needed to do something about kind of a level set baseline. You must be this tall to ride the ride for electric sector security. So a handful of us put all that together in the early days. And then since then, I've been part of the NERC landscape, I'll say, as a working group member for multiple NERC working groups, an advisor to FERC technical committees, and I've even advised other countries on implementing regulations like NERC CIP.
For someone early or mid in their career, like what's kind of the best advice you have for, you've been in this space a little bit, like if someone's out there thinking like, how do I get into this space if I want to do it when I grow up? Like, what's your best advice today for that?
We get this question all the time, Dan. It's kind of like saying, I don't want to go into medicine. I mean, do you want to be a doctor, a surgeon, a radiologist? There's just so much to do in our space. Find something but two things: you need to like it and you need to be good at it. And not like, like a natural, Michael Jordan, but as long as it's something that you're proficient at, you like doing it, then try it out and see if it's something you want to do. I can say for people in cybersecurity in general, OT security is way cooler. And sorry to all my IT security brethren, and folks, but OT security is way cooler because we're a lot more mission focused. And it's just, it's a different landscape of systems. It's a different set of issues. It's a different time base. So all of it just makes it a much, I don't know, it's just got a sense of, I don't know, you feel better about what you do at the end of the day, or at least I do. Maybe it's just me, but.
And for someone cynical, that's probably a good segue. For someone cynical and to like, why should we care about regulations? Is this just pushing paper, a waste of time? Like, why do regulations matter? I mean, how's it like, where are you seeing it come out well? Where are you seeing, positive, right? Is there being a bar good enough, right? Or kind of what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. Regulation is usually a knee-jerk response to something that happened because there was an irresponsible party. And that doesn't mean like everyone was irresponsible. That means the one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch problem, where there are a lot, we'll just use NERC CIP because it's kind of the topic. There are a lot of utilities doing phenomenal security work, like really top-notch level security, better security than I see in many, many other places. They're also required to adhere to the same standards that utilities that are not doing that in any way, shape, or form, and they are treating it as though it's a paper exercise and a checkbox situation. So regulation is designed to give everybody a minimum threshold or a minimum bar. Now, with the electric sector and many other sectors in similar situations, we've got to deal with a utility the size of like Duke, or Mid-American. These are monstrous organizations, like Fortune 500, maybe 200 companies even. They're giant organizations. And they've got more money than God in some cases when it comes to, these kinds of at least resources to secure themselves against like, some irrigation district or something like that that's really small, or some other municipality or something like that with really restricted budgets, very restricted talent pools or geographic locations to even get talent pools or budgets. But we had to come up with one standard that, was a minimum threshold for all of them. So as you can imagine, that drives the bar pretty low. So when you hear, don't get me wrong, the SIP standards are challenging. They're hard, but they're not like the hardest thing ever. It's the lowest bar that every utility of certain size and function can meet. So they happen because something needed to give everybody a minimum. And then is it a good idea? Yeah, it's not a bad idea. I think regulation should be done slowly, methodically, carefully because of the unintended consequences. We shouldn't there's like knee-jerk reaction regulation is always bad regulation. So it has its place, it has its function, and it is really to tell everybody at least do these minimum things. I think the biggest challenge with it is not just the unintended consequences, because those are definitely there, but its biggest challenge is when people treat that floor, that low bar, as the ceiling. Like, this is all we're going to do. This is all we're required to do. Dang it. That's all we're going to do. And in reality, that your critical infrastructure in America, or North America for that matter, you should be definitely going above and beyond that minimum bar.
And for those not familiar, you're mentioning NERC CIP, which obviously, as you said, kind of covers the power sector. But what parts of U.S. critical infrastructure are regulated, right? And to throw a softball in, and to what level are they regulated to, right? Because to throw in, right, there were the TSA regulations that dropped down, and then the rail regulations came out too, and largely portions seem to be a direct copy of some of the TSA ones. So, like, what is regulated in critical infrastructure, both in the US and globally? And like, why does that matter?
Yeah, it's a patchwork in the US. And it's not just that the regulations are different, but the authorities enforcing the regulations are different. And this matters because I would rather have, frankly, a crappy regulation in the hands of an experienced and thoughtful and balanced regulator versus the world's best possible regulation ever written in the hands of an inexperienced and clumsy regulator. So it really does matter. A really good balanced regulator that understands their sector can handle that in ways that are far more effective and useful. So given that kind of backdrop, the electric sector is regulated by FERC, NERC CIP standards, in addition to the O&P standards, operations and planning standards, non-security related, but they support it in a sense. The water sector was almost regulated. It was the DHS CPGs, or cyber cross-sector cyber performance goals, were originally imposed by the EPA and the EPA doesn't really regulate directly. They regulate the states to regulate the utilities in the state. So the EPA basically pushed this down to the states. The states and the utilities fought back, and the EPA backed off. And now they're examining kind of what path they want to take. They're proposing something like NERC. We'll see what that looks like, but they're currently unregulated as far as cybersecurity goes. As you mentioned, the TSA pipeline security directives, they're from TSA, and they manage gas pipelines. FERC actually has a little bit in the gas space as well. FERC also manages hydroelectric dams for security, but really only the remotely operated dams have cybersecurity regulations, and those are about 10 years old and untouched. Nuclear has their own set as well. And then when we get into things like shipping and rail, as you mentioned, they have some that look a lot like the ones from the pipelines, and so does the air transportation. Again, looks a lot like what you saw. Pretty much the TSA stuff is kind of I mean, nothing against what TSA has done, maybe against what TSA has done, but it looked kind of like a grab bag. Like it just threw a bunch of security controls in a bag and randomly pulled some out and said, do these things. And regardless of how onerous they are, but you go tell a pipeline operator to go change PLC passwords, and you're talking about rolling a truck to like 400 sites. That quickly becomes like infeasible on many different levels. So I think that a more thoughtful approach probably would have given them more traction and more adoption and less friction. That said, like in the medical space where we do have OT, it's really nothing. It's just about patient data. Like electronic patient records is pretty much all. But then again, you've also got things like, MRIs that you can overspin to break out of their building, for example, which would be a problem, or medical beds where you can fold people into little origami shapes. That's a problem too. So we've got a bunch of other like OT based infrastructures, manufacturing, food and ag that just don't have any regulations at all. And I think this is the challenge with the patchwork of different things. DHS tried to resolve this. It was originally a national security memorandum with those CPGs I mentioned earlier, where you've got 5 sectors: water, wastewater, chemical, gas, and electric. I'm sorry, yeah, chemical, gas, and electric. Those 5 sectors were asked to do like what's kind of a minimum for all 5, and same controls, just applied across the board. So they tried to kind of get some harmonization. That hasn't gotten a ton of traction. We'll see where it goes from here, but the idea is good because it makes it easier to measure multiple infrastructures with a common measurement. And why that matters is because you have different technologies, different skill sets, different attorneys, and different consultants that all do the different things. It just makes it easier to give them kind of a similar approach. Like if everyone picked, 882 or IEC 62443, we could measure against a common set of measurements. So that's why this patchwork is a bit of an issue. In addition to the fact that, NERC CIP has got like used to be $1 million per day. It's adjusted for inflation. It's like $1.73 million per day per violation. Maximum penalties, no one's ever gotten there. But and then you got the TSA stuff, which is arguably not financially penalized. There's other methods they've got to kind of arm twist you and drag you kicking and screaming into it, but that really creates a bunch of like, weird incentives in different directions and all the other problems. So I wish it were better, but that's where we are for now.
And I think there's some interesting dynamics in there. And sorry, my camera keeps flickering on and off. It does this sometimes. I think there's some interesting dynamics in there, though, where like you have a regulation like NERC CIP, right? And you go into CIP's 007-6, right, into the cybersecurity side, and you get down into fines for like, hey, if you declare an incident and you don't do these steps, you don't report it, or it's on this criticality of event, you have super granularity, right? And so, and you have like, right, CIP has been like, right, I'm sure the number of CIP working groups and asset owner input and, how CIP grows. What's really cool for those not aware in the electric sector is CIP very much can be a community effort on there, to where
Literally
some
is.
of those government ones like the TSA, like they might do a call for comments from industry, or they might send it over, to an FFRDC, a choice, or someone to push through. But, also on these regulations, right, what's interesting is, CIP really is that community side. It's funny, asset owners are calling us as a few months back as IR changes and other things were getting pushed in, and being like, hey, what should we do? How do we stay, to avoid your point, the fine? Because one of my favorite examples of where you can cross and the bill quickly adds up, right, is there was a asset owner that had BS data. They had grid data out on a S3 bucket that a vendor put it out there. The asset owner is the one that actually got fined by it, though, right? And the fine was, I think, a 6-figure. It might have added up to 7. My memory's rough on it, but what's funny with these is that, like, it's not necessarily the vendor. The vendor is going to get hit by the asset owner, probably in a lawsuit sense on that, but the fine is going to the asset owner.
Exactly. And the penalties go to the asset owner, regardless of whether there was any vendor involvement of any kind in the mix, even, neighboring utilities, if there are other third parties of any kind, the fine goes to the utility. And I think that one in particular was a $1.8 million penalty.
Yeah, it added up quick.
Mhm.
Um, where are you seeing asset owners make mistakes? I mean, I guess start with electric power. Like what low-hanging fruit are people missing?
Yeah, I mean, the low hanging fruit is they're not, well, okay, you got to back it up. I was going to say they're not detecting incidents, but they're also not architected to get the data they need to detect the incidents, because in a lot of cases, they just don't have the capability, I
Mhm,
mean, to get the level of data they need to get the visibility they need. So it's, it's a bit of a, kind of a horseshoe nail issue, because you end up losing the whole battle because you had lost a horseshoe nail, lost a horseshoe, lost a horse, lost a rider, lost. So you end up with this whole kind of cascading issue. But if you
mhm,
don't have an architecture where you can get decent telemetry, you're at best going to be trying to muck around on device by device lookups and scripting and all this other kind of really clumsy approaches that
mhm,
may work in a pinch, but they're definitely not going to give you any sort of kind of assurance that you've got this dialed. So it just the ability to know, that you have a problem is the
mhm,
first step, and then doing something about it is a completely different situation. But I think
mhm,
most organizations don't test enough because it would uncover those issues and those problems. So just running through regular tests is absolutely key. If your fire department isn't running through drills, don't trust them to put fires out in a reasonable time. It's just, I mean, it's just a reality. It's got to be like,
mhm,
especially for like an electric utility, when the alarms go off, those crews know exactly what to do to jump in the truck, what gear they need, where the outage is exactly. And that's because they've spent a lot of time practicing. I mean, we need to be doing the same thing with our incident response teams.
mhm,
And we'll know, I mean, through enough incident response exercises, if you're doing it right and you're not just checking a box, you'll know where all the problems are. You'll know, like, crap, we can't see telemetry from this section, or that incredible, really important box, or we're missing this entire set of logs, or in the event that someone did actually get things like, admin privy, we would not have system of record logs. We would only have the escrowed versions, and all kinds of those little technology issues, and not the least of which all your process issues that come along with the human aspect. But I think the part that they really should focus on is you'll figure out where all the other problems are just by running exercises, and good exercises.
And also on that, a fun one I participated in a few years ago, a national exercise, to where they were testing incident response, and I was actually on the outsourced third-party vendor,
Mhm.
IR retainer, right? And it was funny, right? Because this was a tabletop exercise, but the asset owner we were working with was like, hey, let's actually pull data. If Dan at company X calls engineer down in the field, like what are they going to tell Dan? Are they ready to collect data? Is the data even there? Do we know how to transfer this, you know, sensitive data that again is highly regulated data that has those fines we mentioned? Can we even get it to in our vendor in a time to not bust a SIP timeline or bust another timeline on getting back? And people don't think sometimes all the way through. They don't exercise, to your point, all the way through of like the complexity is hard, right? And we still have it all the time, even on regular stuff when we're working with asset owners that have lots of sites on being like, okay, we're cyber people working across. Well, when I call engineering at site 10, they might know who we are, but how do the engineers at site 40 deal with us when, some outsiders call and asking for a bunch of data? And it's people that haven't explored it, don't always understand what they're in for.
No, and that is a really great piece of advice. I even recommend that they engage the business continuity components.
Yep.
And so, like, when you kick off an incident, business continuity should be coming along right underneath them to follow along, just in case you need to do things like, I'm going to chunk off a whole piece of my networking. And so, what are the containment efforts that you're going through to operate through kind of a degraded state, basically being resilient, continued operations, and then take it all the way down to a recovery exercise. I mean, if you're not testing that part too, you're missing an opportunity. So I
Yep.
always take the incident exercises all the way through BCP into recovery, because you don't know if you can actually recover that box until you try it.
Yeah, and it's funny, even within government going back, I was at the Air Force CERT early on in my career, and to date myself, US CERT was still a thing back then. And there were triggers that at the Air Force CERT we would have to call US CERT for. And I remember I was a night shift, so I'd work 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And it'd be funny because we'd trigger stuff and then we'd call US CERT and be like, hey, we just triggered this thing on this response. And they'd be like, why are you calling us? And we're like, hey, like government to government, our checklist still says we have to
Yeah,
call you. It shouldn't be a surprise. And so reducing those surprises is key.
yeah. Kind of like, why is this a surprise? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And now it's only more complicated with, with the Air Force, right? It's everything from PII to critical infrastructure to everything else you know, with asset owners as more and more fall under that umbrella, it gets challenging. And then, much less before you look at asset owners that have, global footprints. And it's like, how do I deal with GDPR and incident response? And there may be being user data or, hey, in Saudi Arabia, critical infrastructure data can't leave the country. So how do you do IR,
yeah,
without leaving the country if a country like Saudi has rules like that? And all of that adds up quick and also can create very uncomfortable situations if you're not aware of the environment and geography you're in.
yeah. That's why tests matter. Actually run through it. Yeah.
Yeah, we've had to destroy many hard drives on keeping data where it should be.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Sam, let me pull you in for some of the scenarios. I know we had also some questions you had pushed through. I think this was a good overview. I know some of the questions might overlap, but it's still good to hit some of the same things again.
Yeah, no, that was a great overview. So, you guys were talking this through, and one of the questions I want to get into, because Patrick, you I think mentioned this, but how do you make sure that your vendors are helping you be compliant, or like if there's an issue that is a vendor, at cause, you mentioned that the asset owners who's going to be fined for it, how do you maintain that from an asset owner's perspective? How do you ensure that the vendor is, keeping up with your standards?
Contract language is one way. Yeah. And then of course, uh, actually asking them for evidence, audits of your third parties, which no one likes. Both parties don't like to do it. But when I was the auditor, um, that they always got that I always had two questions that absolutely just floored them every time would be, first one is, how do you know? Okay, that's great. I hear you saying that. Now prove it. Like, okay, so where's like a document I can hold, a piece of evidence I can see that supports what you're saying? And the other one is, how do you know you captured the known universe of issues? So like, prove to me that you actually went to the full extent of exploration on this to show that you've actually got all situations, systems, people, whatever the thing is, covered. But those are two questions that are particularly difficult to answer. So when you say like, how do you know you got all of it? Okay, so let all your vendors. Let's see the vendor list. And then let's see that you checked on them and proof of that. So that ability to maintain that level of documentation is very challenging. And it's performing it is frankly, painful in a lot of cases. So, I mean, compliance and audits are by no means, for most at least, they're not fun exercises. But I mean, there really isn't any other way for you or any other outside party to have assurance. Other than that, kind of guessing.
Yeah. Dan,
And
anything from you on that one?
continuously doing it, right? Like like SOC 2 is a good example, right? There's SOC 2 type 1 to where it's kind of a one-time audit, then there's a type 2 SOC 2 where it's continuous audit, right? And
Yep.
we have customers where we have to maintain certain levels of segmentation or certain levels of like, hey, only certain citizenships are allowed to touch certain projects. Or what's fun with the NERC CIP side is for that side we're regulated with, you end up doing 4 or 5 NERC CIP trainings a year. So you're up to date on everyone's NERC CIP training, and they
Yeah.
don't carry over, and you do the same SANs, or there's only a few vendors, so you see the same training every time. And so it but it's key to Patrick's point. Like we actually do maintain an office for that reason, and there's hardening on the office, and there's data that stays inside a pretty protected VPN that our office network also isn't a flat network. So checking all the things that you do that kind of that cybersecurity hygiene that can add up quick.
Well, you don't want to be the weakest link for one of those companies as well. I mean, also as a consulting firm, we do the same thing in
Yeah.
terms of compartmentalization, multiple different compartmentalizations of data, different text, different networks. So yeah, do the same thing. And I think I've seen every possible training program under the sun. Yeah, I've been through so much NERC CIP training. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you wrote the book on it, I guess. So like
Which
you've,
is interesting. Yeah, like, to that point though, Sam, and even Dan, as you mentioned, for the training that you go
Yeah.
through, there's some training that can be canned and it can be, I
Yeah.
guess, kind of, portable, repeated across multiple different companies. But there are some training requirements in CIP4 that are specific to the utility. One of them is your incident response practices. I mean,
Mhm.
you have to have specific practices for your company that you train the people on. So there are some things that are just unique to those specific entities.
Mhm.
yeah. So I guess getting into that a little bit more, that kind of leads me into my next question, which, which the best way to prepare for that, obviously, if there are standards saying, yes, you have to have an incident response plan in place, and there are people that are going to say, okay, I have a plan, and that checks the box, but how do they make sure that it's like, what's the best practice in your opinion to make sure that they are prepared, and that that plan is the best plan to make sure that they are meeting those compliance standards, other than just saying, here's my plan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the standards basically have three components. You have to have a plan, and a plan has to have standard elements like identify, classify, respond, that kind of thing. Then you have to test the plan, which is a required. There's a certain window for medium impact and high impact. It's basically once a year, and then for low impact, it's once every 3. So there's a requirement to have the plan. There's a requirement to test the plan, and then last but not least, this is one of the ones I helped write. Is there's a requirement to update the plan based on what you learn from the tests, and not just update the plan, but from tests. But if you change your technologies, like maybe you insert some of Dan's awesome tech into your kit, that would change your incident response approach, your incident response plan and procedure. And as such, you have to update that when everything from personnel, roles, numbers, organizational shift, technology changes, things like that you're also required to update the plan based on that. So it's designed to be, have, do, and then refine kind of thing. But that's built into the standard. I do think it's one of the better ones out there. They're not perfect by any stretch, right? They could all use some improvement. And they're trying to refine it with things like attempts to compromise and stuff like that. We can talk about the whole reporting aspect, which is completely different. But in terms of actually like containing an incident and being a reliable, resilient company, just that part of having a plan, testing the plan, and then refining the plan based on your tests is key.
Okay.
And there's benefits, I'll pipe in there too. There's benefits to making sure that plan side's solid. And there's benefits too to like, you never, like generally it's a bad practice to kick off a relationship in an incident response scenario. Ideally, you've been out to a few of their sites, you've seen their safety training, because also things that slow incident response that could catch up to you on the regulation side is like, have you ever been out there? Have you worked with that team before? Do you understand the politics of that team? How do the IT and OT teams work together? Who's that one old guy at the plant or gal at the plant that is the one that has to get you into into the data that's needed, right? Or can they even pull that right? Can the cybersecurity even team do it, or what sign-offs does engineering have to have, right? And so building that relationship before, it's not just a cyber practice, it's also that practice of you go out to some pretty caustic environments sometimes, and sometimes you need those trainings of like, hey, don't stick your hand in the vat or eat a laundry pod.
Yeah. I've
Yeah.
seen stuff like an incident responders trying to go onto a manufacturing floor and basically being in such a hurry that they came in with things like jewelry and rings, which of course, in almost every one of them that's forbidden. And they literally were ushered right back off the floor, and it slowed the process down by probably another 15 to 30 minutes. Just little stuff like that. And, as you know, with all these situations, in some cases, seconds can count, especially with like ransomware. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess getting into that, like let's get into when an incident actually happens. We've kind of talked up to this point until, what happens before an incident. How do you prep for it? So an incident happens. What do you think are the most you guys kind of talked about this a little bit about what what's the low-hanging fruit, I think, across the board, but what do you think are the low-hanging fruit that happens like when an incident happens? What are the things that are getting missed? Like, I think everyone gets a little frantic, I feel like, just because it's like the sky is falling, but what do you think are the best ways to kind of keep it cool and, like stay compliant, and, what do you guys think is best practice there?
Go for it, Dan.
I'll take one. This goes back to the no surprises. And I actually did a energy sec training in Austin here a few years back. And the room was full actually of compliance people, which it was awesome. It was a weird room where all SIP compliance people showed up and they were like, what's threat hunting? And in a day, like I taught a whole SIP compliance group threat hunting, and
Yeah.
like they had great questions. It was a great training exercise. And where I'm going with this is like, having those playbooks, knowing what you're doing, having those playbooks run through legal before, run through, the SIP folks, knowing like, hey, we need to do these in this amount of time to not trigger, kind of a compliance hit or to hit, a certain area, right? Like the worst thing in my mind that can kind of happen is just a cybersecurity team building those kits or building those playbooks and not engaging, the engineering team or the compliance team or legal or everyone else that's involved, right? Because what's going to happen to the point of, you could develop those and run those, but they're not going to be complete to what you actually need to do to stay compliant. And to that point of not being able to get data, you're going to start running down that list and run into, well, who do I call again? Like what does this process even go for? If I have to share SIP high data and it's extremely timely, do I have a kind of blessed off approved avenue of doing that? Or is the answer going to be no, because the risk of breaking compliance is bigger than the risk of whatever's going on, and that's going to create unhappy teams. So my thing always comes into prep and having as big of a team as possible, or as many of those disciplines there. But Patrick, what do you think?
Couldn't agree more. I think just as I mentioned earlier, you test it, and don't just test it in easy ways and check the box. Test it until it breaks, and then test it again until it breaks, and test it. If you're not breaking under the test, you're not doing the test right, period. That's just, I haven't seen a single organization yet that has this so dialed that they come out of a really good, solid IR test with no lessons learned. I haven't seen one yet. And I've seen some phenomenally skilled programs. So even those programs still have refinements, and not just like minor tweaks and polish, but like actual shifts in their plan when they run through this. But you mentioned, Dan, like legal and comms and all those other things. I mean, there may be situations where you need to do things like go to manual. And have you even thought about stuff like, where are the people going to sleep? Or do you have like local trailers you can bring in and feed operators so they don't have to go anywhere because they're going to be on shift round the clock? I mean, all of those things. When this happens to an electric organization of any certain size, and depending on the incident, but there's actually a pretty high likelihood that the governor is going to want to know what the heck is going on, or various different federal agencies may want to know what's going on. And your incident gets very difficult when you've got three-letter agencies roaming around your ops floor telling you, don't fix it. We want to see what the attacker is doing. I mean, you got to test those dynamics, because Sam, to your point, a lot of confusion and fear comes in. That confusion and fear is only there because you've never done it before. But if you've done it before and you know what to do, there's a lot less confusion and fear in the process, and you get rid of most of that. Not all of it, but you get rid of most of it.
And then another fun war story from the field, Sam, was I think one of the best assessments I was on. It was a red team assessment, but it actually triggered into kind of scenarios Patrick's talking about on bringing in. We were doing an assessment on a part of the grid, and we'd finished talking to the cybersecurity team, and we were like, okay, let's go to the ops center and start talking to operators. And we asked operators a few questions, and we ran into one that had been there like 15 years. And we were like, you've been at this keyboard 15 years. How would you break it? And we took his idea and turned it into about 40 lines of Python and brought everything down in a few minutes. And it was one of those things where like, right, if we were staying in that cybersecurity deal, like we wouldn't have gotten to that level, but it took that like, okay, let's start getting those scenarios, right? And those are the scenarios then when it comes into, okay, man, we need to make sure we have these scenarios ready for for a response or for staying in compliance with stuff.
Yeah. When you're building your scenarios, you want to loop in operators, you want to loop in your engineers, and you want to loop in substation techs, relay techs, and you want to loop in physical security. All of that team together can come up with a really challenging scenario that should break you, and that's the goal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. Actually, that is one of the prompts that we got to make conversation is if you were going to break your system, what would you do? You know, if you were going to hack in, what would you do to break it? So I think that that's a great way to look at it. Um, all right. So other things that come up during, you know, you talked about all the agencies coming in and that's a lot of pressure. And then you've got like a lot of people looking down, you know, at what point, I guess it depends on the, you know, the standard that you're, you know, that you're reporting into or that you're held to. But, you know, at what point do you, and this is probably just me from a marketing perspective, but at what point do you know the severity of the breach or the incident, like, and then you know how you have to report it up and how much of an impact it's had?
At least for NERC CIP and the CIRCIA, which is a different incident reporting act. It's for pretty much any critical infrastructure. Still in limbo. We're not really sure where that's going to go, but maybe it'll happen. But for NERC CIP, at least, that's the reportable threshold, and that's basically at the point where you have an operational impact. So you can have a qualified incident, something like malware outbreak in a generation facility, which is actually more common than you'd think, but there's no impact. And a great example of this is Conficker. I mean, a lot of generation plants are just absolutely rife with Conficker, but there's no operational impact. Yes, there is malware running rampant on that system, but it's having zero operational impact. So it really comes down to the reporting threshold is there's two things. When there was an attempt to compromise or an actual incident where there would have been an operational impact or was an operational impact. That's basically the general kind of thresholds for when you know you've got a bigger problem than just you trying to figure it out on your own. That's when you got to notify outside. And you could be a good citizen and notify anytime for any reason. Sure, the ISAC and other groups would certainly be willing to receive that information, but you have to at a certain point. And that's when that threshold is broken. You're kind of in a situation where you're no longer in the choose your own adventure space. Your adventure is now being chosen for you. So, yeah.
And from my perspective, like every incident starts out as an event, but every event is not an incident. And in the regulation space and in NERC CIP, those words have meanings. And I'm not going to define these on this call. That's for every asset owner and their team of lawyers and compliance folks to decide when something becomes an incident, because there are legal ramifications for defining that too late. Defining it too early, you run into a whole lot of problems because you may have run something up that now becomes costly. And so understanding the threshold of an event turning into an incident and what those triggers are and how you stay honest to if you get audited on those is key, right? And we had in places that I've worked and responded to, we've had KPIs built around things on if this, then this triggers an incident, right? Or this triggers this part of it, right? And so that's where as you prep through, like, right, some of it's key on even not coming in, right? Because generally more junior analysts will come in and start calling things incidents, and then you'll quickly beat it out to be like, it's an event right now. And
Yeah. Still in the event stage. Don't call it that.
yeah.
Yeah. And you
But
basically,
there are thresholds where you clearly cross into that. But some of the challenge too, to your point, Sam, of when do you even know? It's hard, right? Volt Typhoon, according to the government, has a 5+ year dwell time, and that's a nation state, dwelling in critical infrastructure environments, right? And so, like, and even when you clean it up, you think you clean things up, but you never 100% know if you've cleaned everything out to a point.
yeah, without like rebuilding it from scratch. And even then, there's still some potential,
Mhm.
especially unless you built it from like fresh media that
Yep.
Because if you're using backups, yeah, it's still an issue. Yeah.
And if Trisus wouldn't have bugged out the way it bugged out, the dwell time could have been longer in a Trisus situation on
Yeah.
something like that.
And when they're really good living off the land, it could be potentially, as long as possible. I mean, that's what they're not dropping payloads anymore. The really good ones aren't. So they're not
Mhm,
coming in the front door with a marching band behind them. It's a lot less obvious, like significantly less obvious.
mhm.
So you've gone through your event, your incident, you have contained it, right? You have resolved it. I hesitate to use that word because I feel like you're like it's never truly resolved, right? It happened. Now you've got like this whole other set of problems moving forward, right? Now you've got to monitor and make sure that you don't have, reinfection essentially. So, what are the best practices for compliance moving forward? And what does compliance look like? Are you still being monitored? Are you still kind of reporting like regular activities up at that point? Like what does kind of the after look like?
Well, with at least for the incident state, there's a couple of different things. There's the standard incident component where you go from event, do the event analysis, it breaks into the incident threshold. It can be an incident, but still not a reportable incident. And then once it's a reportable incident, you kind of go through that. There's this escalation process where you've got these demarcation lines and a lot of documentation starts. And I think one of the key pieces I've seen that isn't really well supported or well explored in incident response is the scribe. And not just having like a scribe, but having a skilled scribe that can take copious notes, listen to multiple conversations, and then when things go beyond that 8 hour day of that poor scribe actually hammering their fingers for 8 hours straight, they need a break and they need someone else to rotate. So I recommend doing things like 2 to 3 to 4 hour shifts with scribes so that you've got really good data capture. This is not just, you know, good for you understanding the incident, but this is also your defensibility in the event that you actually have to go to court over this or get insurance for this or support yourself against a regulator for this. So the most underrepresented and underappreciated role in all of it is the scribe. Um, but the other piece of it is there's this thing called a CIP exceptional circumstance. You can enter into like this state where you can kind of suspend certain standards, not all of them, but certain standards, and then just not do anything and not even worry about being compliant because the situation is so dire. And it's like, for example, if you have an operator on the floor and they have a heart attack, you don't have to like background screen and give the the fireman your training before they can run in and paddle the poor person on the floor to get them back to life. You can kind of suspend even things like malware outbreak and backplane failure, hardware failure, that kind of thing can qualify. So that aside, it's really just, those incident thresholds. Once you hit certain points, you start documenting everything, you start recording everything. As you're de-escalating out, you show your de-escalation procedures to a place where you are now in a known good state and you can resume operations in a compliant position. So it is really all about that, those incident and reporting thresholds, the documentation of those thresholds from the escalation standpoint through the situation all the way down to the de-escalation standpoint.
And it's understanding the thresholds of who you're representing in that, right, Patrick, to expand on a point you hit, that continuous monitoring and that monitoring after the fact to make sure, like, did I actually contain this property, right, properly, right? In NERC CIP, there's obviously you want to close that window, but also, if I put my insurance hat on a minute, loss windows in industrial operations and cyber policies are written off of loss windows. In the insurance space, loss windows also have demarcation lines for the front and back. And insurance companies very much want to know when is that point that the loss window ends. So anything that happens after technically isn't part of the claim of whatever various type of insurance this is coming under, right? And so what's key from both compliance and from insurance on this is having that paper trail, to Patrick's point, to be like, hey, maybe we were wrong and we thought the loss window was closed and now it's still actually open, or we found out like, hey, here's this something that missed, right? And having that work there is work you do keep, right? Because to Patrick's point, like, regulators could come back. They could come back in the window and be like, hey, show your work a little bit.
Yeah, and I think what is often lost on this is it's not, you may have a situation, you may have an event, you may have an incident. You need to keep all that information because if for some reason somebody else has something similar, they're going to come knocking for you and saying, "Hey, you had a similar thing too. Can we get all that data from your thing so we can compare notes and make sure this isn't like a common issue across multiple entities, that kind of thing." And let's say you have one, and then your neighbor has one. That they're going to want to know that those two things were not they were not correlated events. They're not the same threat actor doing the same thing. So having that rich data set through the incident is tremendously useful for all those reasons. And then let's also add on the fact that it really helps with your lessons learned. Like that is the gold mine for your lessons learned.
You can even use that training data if you own the data and you want to use it this way. You can even use that data to train your teams in the future. It's great data to put in. Of course, you want to protect it, and there is risk introduced by keeping it around.
Yeah. Well, depending on how, I mean, if it's a reportable, there's a window of time you got to keep it anyway. It's basically through your audit period. So could be 3 to 9 years, depending upon what kind of entity you are.
All right. Well, we are going to wrap with a hypothetical scenario for you guys to talk through. So here's your scenario. After a ransomware attack, your post-incident analysis reveals that the attacker may have accessed some sensitive configuration files for your SCADA system. For the purposes of this scenario, we're going to say that you are a utility provider. You can pick your SIP level. So don't go low because like I'm Patrick, I'm going to challenge like you. Let's say you have to, you have to report this. So my first question to you is, do you report this to regulatory bodies, even if there's no evidence of direct system manipulation?
That's a fine line. Out of an abundance of caution, I would give them some information, things that might be useful, particularly things like any IOCs, TTPs, IOAs that might be useful that you could share. Other than that, from a legal perspective, you would not be required to report that, given the construct you just gave me. Because unless there's an operational impact, then there really isn't a situation that would qualify as a reportable. Now, that is a very broad brush. We could go into all kinds of interesting little details that might trigger that, right? But generally speaking, the way it was described, that would not be reportable, required to be reportable, that said. But yeah, I mean, I just out of an abundance of caution and being a good citizen for the rest of the utilities, I would share some useful information that others might be able to correlate against.
Yeah. So I guess internally, outside of the compliance side of that, how would you combat that? And Dan, maybe you want to pick up on that, or Patrick, you're welcome to answer that too.
I mean, once you've got your config files that are gone, they know your roadmap. I mean, depending on what kind of devices we're talking about, they could have everything they need for serious problems. I would obviously, the standard things are remote access is something you really need to monitor, and MFA and all the other things that go into like insanely strong, no pun intended, insanely strong remote access controls. And then all the way down to, because if they're config files, we're talking about like true OT. So there's not like, you don't have an EDR tool. You can't put like CrowdStrike on a PLC. It doesn't work. So what I've seen most do is to do things like there's even just scripting you can write. There are some native tools that'll do it too, but hash the configs and pull the configs and make sure they're not changing just in case. Look for any, even, standard users logged in, because really good hackers don't break in, they log in with credentials. I mean, they have the credentials. So that would be my bigger concern, is if it's an adversary that's got to that level, they likely have credentials they could just use to log in and do what they want. So every login should get monitored. Configuration files should be pulled and hash them or something like that to make sure that the integrity of that file doesn't change without your knowledge. And then be ready to go into containment mode for those networks as things like segmentation, so you can begin chunking off networks as needed to try to contain it if needed. But that's about all you can do. There's not a lot, and then obviously have like some immutable backups of those configs in case you gotta burn some devices and pull them back up.
And what I would say, like what I would do as I was supporting an asset owner kind of logicking through this situation is like, there are cases to right. We're seeing, different groups out there, to Patrick's point, using command line, engineering workstation, and other tools, to actually write files or pull files or, interact with things out there. And, you internally, you should gain a level of sophistication on what do they know, what are they looking at, do they know what they're talking about? And a good example of it is on the Ukraine 2016 malware for Indestroyer and crash override. For the ABB SYS 600 system, they were down in the malware. They wrote malware in that case, but they were down to extensions of ABB SYS 600. And so in that case, whoever the asset or whoever the attacker was below there, very clearly went at SYS 600, right? And, and some of looking at what they're doing, how quiet they are, how intentional, does stuff have things from multiple vendors or multiple sectors, right? You can get down to that level to know, like, hey, this was more of an opportunistic or kind of a, just a regular, I don't say regular access broker. Is this someone that's like super, OT focused, think like Trisis level focused type deal? And so that context does significantly matter, because like, ransomware is used by both sophisticated and non-sophisticated users. Ransomware is also used to cover people's tracks, right? And so there's a case on, you don't want to assume how sophisticated they are just off scenario. And so looking for things like that are going to help back to that loss window and level of forensics and level of post monitoring and remediation and other things, and even how you communicate it out, right? Because you could end up in a very tight information sharing channel if you find certain things.
Yes, the small circle of pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, like I put in the chat, if anyone has any questions for Dan or Patrick, feel free to send them in. Anything else compliance-wise that you guys want to cover? Any last thoughts, final thoughts that you guys want to get in here?
I do. You can try to do incident response on your own and you might be pretty good at it. You're going to need a third party. You're going to want to know, get a forensic retainer, get an IR retainer. And this isn't just a commercial for Dan. He does a great job at it. I would recommend him, but you need one definitely, because it's going to exhaust when it really goes south, it's going to exhaust your resources and your capabilities fairly quickly. And honestly, everybody from three-letter agencies, insurance firms, executive management, the governor, everyone is going to want to see that you've got the belt and suspenders approach versus we hope we get it right and we think we practiced it right. It really is something that you cannot wait to do. Don't wait until after the incident starts to do that. Get them on board, get them, and just make it part of the business. Just go ahead and get that budgeted in. I mean, and as you mentioned, Dan, Volt Typhoon, no joke. This stuff's real. So they're not just, this isn't a mystery anymore. Ukraine is an example. Volt Typhoon is an example. I don't know what other examples you need to move, but move.
And understand that OT incident response is a niche. The people that understand planned environments come in safely, even understand what NERC CIP or even to the TSA rail and oil and gas and others. And so finding the right groups, and then as you actually go through, what's the actual capacity of that group? How, if there's a Ukraine scale event that happens, like how quickly can the OT incident response bench be absorbed from the companies out there? Also realize that, only a few days ago, one of the big IR companies in the OT space did a 5% layoff. And so like, it might not just be one retainer if you're hoping to pick up that phone and, have a smiling face out there, right? And understanding, where you are in that criticality. If I pick up the phone, like, and 30 other people picked up the phone, like what's that going to look like, right? And who are they going to be able to send out, and what's their familiarity in this space? And so all of that will also catch up quickly if you cut corners, or if you're like, hey, I'll just let my IT people handle this. You'll end up in a really rough spot.
They'll be helping you.
Patrick and Dan, actually that final thought made me think of a question, one last question here. So, as you talked about that, having an IR retainer, I imagine that standards for compliance get stronger over time. We know that the threats are getting more intelligent. So what can asset owners do to prepare over the next, 1, 3, 5 years, when they're considering budgeting, when they're considering, adding new things to their cyber programs, what should they be looking at and prioritizing over the next couple of years to make sure that they're prepared to meet the challenges that are coming?
And it starts with prevention, it goes into detection, and then it rounds up with response. And you get on that hamster wheel of death nonstop and just keep doing it and keep getting better at it. Just don't think that because you're small that it matters. Small people are training grounds and they're connected to big people. So you're just as big a target as anybody else, and packets don't care about the size of your company or how big your 10K was. So, those I don't know how far regulation is going to go in the US because of the current administration. There's even some talk of removing some of the federal layers and pushing it down to the states, which honestly just means you may have 50 different options to choose from if you operate nationwide instead of one approach. So I would say, if anything, start paying more attention, because we really don't know which direction this is going from the regulatory aspect, at least between the federal and the state concerns. The threat actors are obviously changing and doing more things, which causes us to react in ways. So we may see reactions based on their actions at the federal or state level. So all of this unfortunately, it means a little more chaos to watch and pay attention to. And you're going to have to monitor things a lot more closely, not just on the threat actor landscape, but on the regulatory landscape for every footprint you operate at the local, state, regional, and federal levels.
Mm-hmm. And to add on to that, to wrap us up, geopolitics, and we're in 2025, right? May 2025, when this is being recorded, is a new administration's just past 100 days. The geopolitics of new administrations, does play into the cyber landscape and how this goes. And attacking critical infrastructure isn't new to countries. In World War II and World War I, it was bombing factories that made parts. OT networks are part of military targeting in a lot of different countries, and understanding the geopolitics and how it overlaps. And hey, there's probably a reason Congress is talking about it a lot beyond bringing money to their districts. And so being ready for an incident response in a contested environment, and being, to the point of today, having that regulation in the right spot is key.
I'll do my best to influence what I can, but I'm one person with a pointy stick. We'll see how far I can push it.
Yep. Well, cool. Thanks, Patrick, for joining us.
You bet. Thanks.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. Great
thank you
discussion.
so much, Patrick and Dan, for the time today. This was a great discussion. Join us next month in June. We will be talking about living off the land attacks with a couple of our analysts. So we'll have the registration link for that up shortly, and we will see you all next month. Thanks again, guys. Bye.